Hey, David Brewster here with another episode of Breaking Chords, and this is Eddie Van Halen-Style Arpeggios. And that, of course, was the tapping section from his famous solo Spanish Fly. And I know when I was a kid, or a teenager, or preteen, early teenager, I was fascinated by Van Halen's, tapping. I couldn't get enough of it. As soon as I learned how to do this, that was a dangerous thing for me to learn, because as soon as I learned that, I was like a little kid on a bike, just zooming around, on the fretboard, trying to figure out how to tap, as many different ways as I could figure out. And, it was useful to have, people like Van Halen around, but then I also picked up things from Steve Vai and Vito Bratta and a whole bunch of people, Red Beach. And this lesson, although we're going to be looking at some very famous, Van Halen tapping moments, I'm going to approach this and teach it in a very different way. I've honestly never seen anybody do this before. I have mentioned this in a few other episodes and lessons, but Eddie Van Halen's the entire reason I started playing guitar. I became obsessed with him when I was about 12 years old, and I couldn't get enough, and that lasted for years. And then, he still kind of remains the center of my musical universe, because at the end of the day, I find myself playing things and doing things that's totally inspired by him. And sometimes it happens and I don't even realize it until afterward. And it's like, oh wow, I think I just totally stole another thing, from Van Halen. But this lesson's going to be very different. We're going to look at the tapping section from Eruption, also Spanish Fly, and also the intro from Hot for Teacher. And even if you know these songs, or the tapping sections of those songs, I'm going to break down actually what's happening behind the scenes. So we're going to talk about the tapped figures, but then we're actually going to talk about what they are, where they come from, and then how you can tap into this too with your own music. We're going to start with the granddaddy of them all, the tapping section from Eruption. And I learned this very early on, or I attempted to learn it very early on, and then kind of, reworked it and kind of perfected it, still when I was a kid. But it took me, a long time to kind of go back and realize something about that tapped figure that I'd never really studied or even paid attention to. And you might be thinking, well, what's that? And that's chords, or arpeggios, technically. And I know when I was younger and I hadn't, been to school and I didn't really understand theory and scales and keys and, chord construction and stuff like that, I just assumed he was playing some type of scale. I didn't really realize, whenever you hear Van Halen tap, usually he's tapping an arpeggio. It's implying some sort of chord or a series of chords. So with the famous tapping section from Eruption, which is this, those all basically based around chords. Those are arpeggios. So you can see right there, there's a C sharp, an E, and also a G sharp right there. So if we relate that to a chord, that's actually C sharp minor, is what that's implying. Same three notes, but when you think about it in a chord format, it's a little different way of looking at that, where it's like, oh, that's actually a piece of a chord. Now, whenever it changes and you hear that note go up to A, now that's going to change it to A major. So we just heard it go from C sharp minor to A major, and then it's going to basically move to A diminished. Okay, and then a little piece of B, and then a little piece of E, and then you're going to hear C major, and then it's Van Halen, so there's a C sus2 to D, and then a D sus2 to to E. And that's basically, you know, the tap section from Eruption, but played as chords. Which obviously sounds very different compared to this. But even the lick that comes in right after that, which I've called this the Eruption turnaround, or nicknamed it that for a long time. But when you have that descending kind of blurry phrase that Eddie played all over that first album, this one. And it's basically still outlining chords. That kind of classical, you know, resolution there at the end between that E minor and B. But right there you can see we're basically playing like a little piece of E7, and then a little piece of E diminished, and then a little piece of A minor to E. And you can kind of hear. And if I just kind of finger pick through that, you can kind of still hear that lick. And the whole thing goes down a whole step. But it's the same thing. Really interesting. Now for another example of breaking this down, let's look at what I opened the video with, you know, the tapping section from Spanish Fly. And this one always interested me because I noticed, you know, he had his fingers really, you know, fanned out, and he was moving across the strings, you know, kind of maintaining the same pattern. But, you know, initially my ears didn't really hear chords or arpeggios. I just heard a whole bunch of notes, you know, flying by. But then, you know, later I kind of picked up the fact that there's actually a chord progression, you know, hiding right in the middle of this. So let's look at that. So right there we've got, you know, D, F sharp, and A. For that first, you know, pattern on the first string. Now, if you know chord construction, you'll know that's a D major chord. You know, there's your root, your third, and your fifth right there that he's tapping. So there's D major. And he's going to move over to the next set of strings and do the exact same thing. So that's going to be G major. There's your root, your third, and your fifth of G. And then you move over again, and it happens again for C major. So when you move those first three strings in the tapping section from Spanish Fly, you're literally moving from D to G to C. So you're kind of doing this. You know, there's your D, I guess. There's your G. And then here's your C. And then you're going to hear it kind of mutate right there. Right? So there it kind of shifted to E minor and then B major. So right there you'll hear that progression across the strings. And that's literally. And then you're going to hear the exact same thing down a whole step. So now we're going to start on C. And right there you can hear, you know, C, move to F, move to B flat. So if you're still kind of learning the notes on the fretboard, or maybe you're still learning like chord and arpeggio construction, this is a really good thing for you to dive into because you can literally see it right before, you know, your eyes. You can see it right there under your fingers. As far as those triads, you know, the C, there's C, E, and G, your triad. F, there's F, A, and C, the F triad. And then when you move over to B flat, there's B flat, B, and F, which is the B flat triad. And just like what happened with the first installment there, when it moves down, that basically moved to D minor, and then it finished on A. And then you'll hear it move down here. And we're going to basically do the same type of thing, but now in a different key. So now we're going to start with this A, C sharp, and E, and that would definitely be A major. Move over to the next string, there's D major right there. Because there's your D, F sharp, and A that you're playing. Next is G major. Okay, and then that note's going to move back to the 4th fret. Now you've got this F sharp, B, and D, and that's B minor. And then when it moved over, that's F sharp major right there. Because there's your root, your 3rd, and your 5th that you're playing. You know, really interesting. And then it's going to wrap up with the single string move, and that's going to be a D right here. And then it moves down to this, it's a C6. And then C major, basically. And then that's going to move down to the 2nd fret. That's going to basically function as part of E minor. And then that's basically part of B right there, B major. So it's really interesting to notice, you know, that this melodic, tapped, you know, very famous guitar solo is literally just jam-packed with arpeggios and a chord progression, you know, that you're hearing move. And I know when I first learned that, it blew my mind, where I thought, whoa, I didn't really realize that's what was going on, you know, behind the scenes there. So if you wanted to, you could turn that entire tapping section into a little chord study like this. That's really interesting because you can still hear Spanish Fly, even though I played it just basically as little triads and little chords. But that basically kind of proves how powerful, you know, a strong chord progression or arpeggio progression can be, because you can still hear what that is, even if I just play it, you know, in a completely different way. Here's another, you know, really famous Van Halen tapping moment. This is the intro to Hot for Teacher. And I know when I first learned this, I didn't really relate it to Eruption or Spanish Fly. I just kind of saw it as a different thing. But it really is kind of related to Spanish Fly a little bit. But then that first thing you hear... If we actually break that down chord-wise and kind of look at what the arpeggios actually are, you'll see that we have A minor, and then it's going to move to a D over A, and then it's going to move to D minor, and then a G over D, and then G minor, and then a C over G. So right there, just having those 3, you know, sets of strings, and you've got kind of 2 arpeggios on each string. And you can still kind of hear that arpeggio. Right? Same thing. It's a very unusual, you know, fingering to kind of play along with that with chord shapes, but you can still kind of mimic the sound of all of those tapped arpeggios, which is eye-opening and kind of interesting. All right, I'm certain most of you probably see what I'm breaking down in this lesson, but I'm not trying to show you the wrong way to play these intros. I'm actually trying to help you get a little deeper into understanding where this came from. Now, knowing Van Halen and kind of knowing his background and, you know, the kind of holes in his knowledge and experience with music, he probably just played these shapes. Like I doubt he was actually thinking of the chord progressions. I could totally be wrong. That is kind of one of the mysteries about Eddie Van Halen. Like, what does he actually know and what does he not know? Because certain things that he does, it does have a very, you know, certain level of authority or conviction where it's like, I think he knows what he's doing right there, you know. And then other things that he plays, like the intro to Mean Street or something, it's so unorthodox and weird and left field where it's like, I think he just picked up a guitar and just started playing that. So he's really hard to pin down sometimes. Like, did he know what he was doing there, or did he just kind of do it? And with some of these things, I think maybe he had an idea. Maybe he had a basic key in mind, or maybe he could kind of hear like a little bit of a progression. But who knows? Honestly, I wish I could like sit down and interview or talk to him and just say, what were you thinking, when you came up with these things? Were you thinking of anything, or were you just kind of moving your fingers, or just kind of using your ear, guiding you towards some of these different sounds and chords and implied, tonalities? So anyway, leave some feedback and some comments, and please subscribe to Late Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more content material. Thank you.